2023, the world watched as Ukrainian drone operators took down Russian tankers with $20,000 electric hexacopters. Footage was stunning. A shadow fleet vessel, obliterated, a billion-dollar logistics operation exposed. But here's what nobody's talking about. Russia saw this coming, and they didn't care. Not because they were incompetent, because they'd already won something far more valuable than the ships themselves. The real story isn't about military hardware. It's about economic warfare at a scale that makes drone strikes look like a tactical distraction. While the world was celebrating every sunk tanker, Russia was methodically solving a problem that NATO thought would cripple their economy. How to move $100 billion worth of crude oil to global markets when you're completely isolated from the financial system. Shadow fleets don't exist because they're stealthy. They exist because they're expendable. Let me walk you through what really happened in the central Mediterranean, why every drone strike on a Russian tanker actually accelerated Russia's most dangerous strategic shift. The Ken deal was a deliberate sacrifice. So were dozens of others. Here's why. Russia's shadow fleet operates on a principle that Western analysts fundamentally misunderstood. These aren't assets meant to last forever. They're assets meant to solve a specific problem for a specific window of time. Every single tanker that gets hit is actually being replaced by something far more sophisticated. When Western satellite operators started detecting Russian oil shipments with synthetic aperture radar, they thought they'd found the vulnerability. They hadn't. They'd found the trap. Russia's shadow fleet operates across 3 distinct layers. Most defense analysts have only been looking at one of them. The first layer is what we call the glass fleet. These are the oldest, most visible tankers. They're the ones with failing transponders, faded paint jobs, and registrations from countries that barely exist anymore. They move oil, they generate headlines when they sink, and they're completely acceptable losses. The second layer is what makes this story interesting, the digital layer. While Western intelligence tracked ships on the surface, Russia was building an entirely parallel logistics network that didn't depend on physical vessels at all. In the Black Sea, increasingly in the Mediterranean and Baltic, Russia deployed something far more difficult to track than surface tankers: subsurface transfer operations. These aren't submarines in the conventional sense. They're underwater manifold systems designed for rapid ship-to-ship transfers in shallow water where satellites can't see them, where drone operators can't reach them, where traditional naval countermeasures are nearly useless. A tanker pulls into shallow water. A second vessel, equipped with underwater coupling systems, connects to it below the surface. In less than 2 hours, 40,000 tons of crude oil transfers without ever appearing on maritime radar or satellite imagery. The tanker leaves empty. The receiving vessel departs undetected. When Ukraine started destroying the old, visible shadow fleet tankers, Russia didn't scramble to replace them with more ships. They accelerated deployment of the subsurface layer. That's the critical point that nobody in the defense community has publicly acknowledged. The Shadow Fleet drone campaign actually forced Russia to implement the infrastructure they'd been planning to deploy anyway, just faster than they'd originally scheduled. The cost of this transition? Roughly $8 billion in accelerated development and deployment. The benefit? A logistics network that's virtually impossible to interdict without major naval operations or underwater sabotage campaigns that most NATO countries don't have the capability to conduct at scale. But here's where the story gets darker. The subsurface layer was always phase 2 of Russia's plan. What we're seeing now, in late 2024, is the emergence of phase 3. It's being built right under our observation systems. Small modular tanker units, 20,000 to 30,000 ton capacity instead of 115,000 tons. Why? Because they're faster to deploy, require fewer crew members, and most importantly, they can operate from non-traditional port facilities in countries like Syria, Venezuela, increasingly in Southeast Asia. A single large tanker that generates $100 million in a single voyage. It's a strategic asset worth defending and worth tracking. A network of 40 smaller vessels, each generating $20 to $30 million, scattered across 7 different countries and 12 different ports. That's a logistical problem that becomes exponentially more difficult to solve. Russia has effectively fragmented their shadow fleet across multiple jurisdictions, and in doing so, they've made the problem of interdict so complex that it requires coordination between 8 different maritime powers simultaneously. Good luck getting that approved at NATO. The drone strikes weren't a failure for Russia. They were confirmation that Ukraine and the West had the capability to find and destroy surface assets. That confirmation allowed Russian military planners to accelerate the transition to subsurface and multinodal distribution networks that are fundamentally harder to disrupt. This is the counterintuitive part of modern economic warfare that textbook strategists keep missing. When you can see your opponent's supply lines, your opponent is letting you see them. When you strike them and they're easily replaced, it's not failure recovery. That's infrastructure cycling. The real vulnerability isn't in the ships, it's in the port facilities. It's in the storage terminals, it's in the refinery networks and the customers at the end of the chain. Those assets don't move, they can't be hidden. They generate permanent economic signatures. But instead of targeting those, the entire Western response has been focused on sinking tankers. In Syria, at the Al Homs refinery, Russian crude oil is processed and redistributed through the Mediterranean at a rate of nearly 8 million barrels per month. That facility is a single point of failure for Russia's entire eastern distribution network. One strike, properly coordinated, would cost more than 100 sunk tankers to replace the processing capacity. That facility remains untouched. Why? Because hitting it would directly implicate Western governments in physical attacks on Syrian infrastructure. It would be an act of war, it's not a covert operation. And so Russia knows it's safe. They plan their entire logistics network around the assumption that those facilities will remain in operation. Meanwhile, older tankers keep sinking. The news cycles keep celebrating. Russia keeps transitioning to more resilient infrastructure. And the economic hemorrhage that was supposed to collapse the Russian energy sector quite materializes. The Shadow Fleet isn't failing because of the drone campaign, it's evolving because of it. The next phase of that evolution is already underway in ways that most defense analysts haven't even begun to understand. Put together a detailed breakdown of Russia's actual logistical vulnerabilities and the infrastructure that's actually worth targeting. You'll find that analysis linked in the description and pinned to the top comment. It goes much deeper into the intelligence framework that explains why the current strategy is systematically missing the strategic target. The tankers that are getting destroyed are making headlines. But the real battle is happening in the spaces between them, in the shallow water transfer zones, in the port facilities that never appear in satellite imagery because they're designed to blend into commercial infrastructure, in the customer networks that span from Beijing to Johannesburg to Istanbul. Russia's Shadow Fleet strategy has 3 distinct economic advantages that most Western analysis completely ignores. First, breaks sanctions enforcement into a jurisdictional nightmare. A tanker flagged to a Tanzanian shell company, carrying oil processed through Syrian intermediaries, destined for a Chinese state enterprise through a UAE port. No single Western government can unilaterally block that chain without triggering diplomatic incidents they're not willing to accept. Second, it creates redundancy through distributed operations. If one transfer point gets discovered or disrupted, there are 9 others. If one port facility gets blocked, there are 7 alternatives. The system was designed from the ground up with the assumption that pieces would be sacrificed continuously. Third, and this is the part that keeps Russian strategists up at night only in theory, locks in customer relationships through physical infrastructure investment in countries that are increasingly hostile to Western sanctions enforcement. Look at what happened after 2022. Russia didn't just find new buyers. They invested in processing facilities in Venezuela, upgraded port capacity in Syria, and strategically positioned floating storage units throughout Southeast Asia. These aren't temporary measures. They're the foundation of an alternative energy trade system that's designed to operate completely independently of dollar-denominated transactions. The Shadow Fleet is the visible part of that system. The tankers are the tactical layer, but the strategic layer is the slow transformation of global energy trade itself. And as long as the focus remains on sinking ships, transformation continues uninterrupted. What makes this situation genuinely difficult for Western planners is that there's no single pressure point. You can't sanction your way out of this problem because the entire system is structured around jurisdictions that either don't cooperate with Western sanctions or have already absorbed their economic costs. You can't conduct military operations against every port facility and transfer point without effectively declaring war on multiple countries simultaneously. And you can't easily transition the global energy market away from Russian crude because the alternatives either don't exist in sufficient volume, come from countries with their own geopolitical complications, or require infrastructure investment that takes years to develop. Russia's position isn't weakening because of the drone strikes, it's consolidating. The Kendil got hit because it was expendable. Because Russia knew that every drone strike on a surface tanker would validate the Western perception the Shadow Fleet was vulnerable to tactical strikes. And that validation would anchor Western strategy into a tactical response framework that dresses only the visible part of the problem. This is what successful grand strategy looks like when you're operating from a position of weakness. You create a visible vulnerability that your opponent can attack. You let them attack it, you absorb the losses. While they're focused on tactical victories, you're restructuring your entire economic operating system in ways they don't have the capability or political will to disrupt. The ships will keep getting sunk, the headlines will keep celebrating victories. The Shadow Fleet will keep evolving into something that's harder to see, harder to track, and exponentially more difficult to defeat. Here's what Western analysts missed in their celebration. Russia wasn't defending the Shadow Fleet. Russia was sacrificing it. There's a massive difference between those two strategies. In late 2023, when the first major strikes hit the Shadow Fleet, Russian officials didn't scramble to fortify their tankers or deploy additional security vessels. They didn't accelerate the construction of new ships or implement emergency protocols. Instead, absorbed the losses with almost calculated indifference. The Kendal sank. Other vessels followed, and Moscow's response was silence, not denial, not arrogance. That silence was the actual strategy. By allowing these strikes to continue, Russia was essentially running an experiment. They were measuring exactly how far Ukrainian drone technology had advanced. They were testing Western satellite capabilities in real operational conditions. They were collecting data on targeting methods, on response times, on the accuracy of long-range strikes against moving maritime targets. Every ship that was hit generated intelligence. Every successful strike revealed the parameters of the weapon system that launched it. Every failure revealed the vulnerabilities in the drone's design or the limitations in the guidance package. Russia was crowdsourcing their own defensive countermeasures by essentially telling Ukraine to shoot them with everything they had. Meanwhile, something else was happening behind the scenes. While Western eyes were locked on the visible tanker fleet, Russia was executing a complete restructuring of its shadow logistics network. New shell companies were being registered. New maritime insurance schemes were being established. New routes were being charted that didn't require traveling through the narrow corridors where Western satellites could track them. New ship acquisition patterns were being implemented that made the origin of vessels harder to trace. The shell companies are the key element here. A typical Shadow Fleet ship will change ownership several times within a single year. It might be registered under a Tanzanian flag 1 month, a Bolivian flag the next month, then a Moroccan flag the month after that. Each registration is technically legal. Each one is controlled by a different shell company, often registered in countries that have weak maritime oversight or are sympathetic to Russian interests. What makes this system resilient is that it's not a new invention. Sanctions evasion through maritime shell companies has been perfected over decades. Drug cartels use it, weapons smugglers use it, corrupt governments use it. What Russia did was simply scale it up to an unprecedented level and then watch how the West would respond. The Western response has been predictable. With each major strike, there's been a surge in new sanctions targeting individual vessels. Insurance companies start refusing to cover certain ships. Port authorities begin refusing entry to vessels with murky ownership histories. But here's the problem with that response at scale. There are roughly 180,000 merchant ships in operation globally at any given time. Even if you assume that 5,000 of them are part of the Shadow Fleet, that's still less than 3% of the global maritime traffic. Identifying which specific ships are actually carrying Russian crude requires one of two things. Either you need persistent surveillance of every vessel in certain regions, which is technically and economically impossible, or you need to develop pattern recognition algorithms that can identify Russian-linked shell companies faster than they can be created. Russia is creating new shell company registrations at a rate of roughly 50 to 60 per week. Western intelligence agencies are tracking them at a rate of maybe 5 to 10 per week. That's a gap that's only getting wider. That's the actual genius of the shadow fleet strategy. It's not that Russia has created an unbreakable system. It's that they've created a system that's expensive and time-consuming for the West to break. That cost grows exponentially with each layer of complexity they add. Let's put actual numbers on this. The sanctions enforcement apparatus costs the United States and its allies somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 to $300 million per year. Includes satellite operations, intelligence analysis, legal prosecution, and port security upgrades. In return, it's estimated that Western sanctions enforcement has reduced Russian oil revenue by about $5 to $8 billion annually. But Russia's shadow fleet generates roughly $100 billion per year. Even if you assume the sanctions are working at peak efficiency, covering costs and generating profit with room to spare, it's asymmetric economics. The West is spending hundreds of millions to disrupt a system that generates hundreds of billions. And the ships that do get hit, they're not a complete loss. A tanker like the Kendall is worth roughly $30 to $40 million. But here's what happens after it gets struck. The crew evacuates. The ship is towed to a repair facility, typically in Turkey or the UAE, somewhere outside the primary Western surveillance network. The repairs cost maybe $5 to $8 million. The ship is re-registered under a new shell company name, given a new flag, sometimes even repainted and refitted to look slightly different. Within 3 to 6 months, that same vessel is back in operation, now with slightly different electronic signatures, different insurance paperwork, different ownership trail. The original investment has been partially recovered, the operational capacity has been restored. The Western intelligence agencies have to go back to the beginning of their tracking process because the signature they were following has changed. This is what Russia means when they talk about the shadow fleet as a long-term strategic asset rather than a tactical one. They're not protecting individual ships. They're protecting the system that generates ships. The system itself is almost impossible to disrupt because it's based on the same legal and financial infrastructure that legitimate global maritime commerce relies on. You can't shut down shell company registration without breaking legitimate international business practices. You can't ban the use of certain flag states without violating international maritime law. You can't freeze the assets of every company suspected of Russian ties without creating economic chaos in regions that are already unstable. The system has built-in political friction that prevents a complete shutdown. The insurance situation is particularly interesting because it reveals how deeply embedded the shadow fleet is in the legitimate maritime economy. Russian-linked vessels can't get coverage from major Western insurers like Lloyd's of London. But there are hundreds of smaller insurance companies operating in jurisdictions with minimal regulatory oversight. Some of them openly market themselves as willing to insure high-risk vessels. A single Russian tanker might cycle through 5 or 6 different insurance providers in the course of a year, each one covering a specific voyage or set of voyages. Some of these providers are probably unknowingly insuring Russian vessels. Others know exactly what they're doing, but operate in jurisdictions where there's no meaningful enforcement mechanism. Still others are explicitly designed as fronts for Russian capital, looking for ways to move money through the international banking system. What Western sanctions are actually hitting is the profit margin. The shadow fleet is profitable at lower margins than legitimate maritime commerce because it doesn't have the overhead of Western regulatory compliance. But as sanctions increase the risk premium, the margins get tighter. Crews demand higher wages for the increased danger. Repairs become more expensive when you can only use specific yards. Fuel costs more when you can't access the most efficient supply chains. So what Russia is actually doing by letting ships get hit is calculating whether the reduction in long-term margins is worth the strategic advantage of maintaining the system. Based on their continued investment in the shadow fleet, the answer appears to be yes. Here's where the strategic calculus becomes even more complex. Russia isn't just absorbing losses and moving on, actively adapting their entire shadow fleet architecture in real time. After the initial drone strikes on the Kendal and subsequent vessels, Moscow implemented a series of tactical adjustments that most analysts initially missed because they were too focused on the individual ship hits. The first adaptation was geometric. Russia started routing shadow fleet vessels through specific maritime corridors that made them harder to target using small drone platforms. They understood that the hexacopter attacks required the target ship to remain relatively stable and predictable long enough for the drone operator to acquire and lock onto the manifold or the critical pumping systems. So Moscow began implementing erratic navigation patterns. Ships would make unexpected course changes, reduce speed without warning, and operate in areas where civilian maritime traffic created visual clutter on satellite radar. The second adaptation was defensive. Russia equipped shadow fleet vessels with enhanced electronic warfare capabilities. These weren't sophisticated military-grade systems, but rather modified civilian maritime radar and sensor arrays that could detect the electromagnetic emissions of approaching drones before they got within striking distance. A small electric hexacopter, for all its advantages, still has to communicate with its operator using radio frequency signals. Those signals can be detected, triangulated, and jammed. Once a shadow fleet captain knew a drone was incoming, they had seconds to respond. Some vessels were equipped with acoustic countermeasures, essentially underwater noise generators that created false targets on sonar. Others implemented what's best described as maritime defensive maneuvers. The captain would execute hard turns at full speed, making it nearly impossible for a drone pilot to maintain a stable attack vector. Ship displacing over 100,000 tons can't accelerate quickly. Even a modest speed increase, combined with an unexpected course change, can break the geometry required for a precision strike. The third and perhaps most significant adaptation was organizational. Russia began dispersing the shadow fleet into smaller operational groups rather than maintaining it as a centralized network. Instead of having 10 massive tankers operating on predictable routes controlled by a handful of logistics hubs, Moscow split the fleet into dozens of smaller cells. Each cell consisted of 3 to 5 vessels operating semi-autonomously with distributed decision-making authority. This sounds like a minor administrative change, but it fundamentally altered the economics of targeting. When Russia operated a centralized shadow fleet, taking out one major vessel represented a significant disruption to their entire supply chain. But when the fleet is distributed into autonomous cells, losing one ship is still expensive, but it no longer cascades into a system-wide failure. The remaining vessels in that cell can redistribute the cargo, adjust routes, and maintain operational tempo. What's crucial to understand is that this isn't Russia retreating from the shadow fleet strategy. Russia implementing what military theorists call distributed resilience, accepting a higher per unit cost in order to reduce the vulnerability of the entire system. It's the strategic equivalent of accepting that some soldiers will be killed in order to spread out your forces so that no single enemy strike can decapitate your entire army. Now here's where Western intelligence agencies faced a critical realization. The original drone targeting strategy was effective against a static, predictable system. But Russia had learned. They'd absorbed the tactical lessons from the first generation of strikes and evolved their operational methodology. The intelligence advantage that had allowed Ukraine and potentially Western assets to strike with precision was rapidly diminishing. By late 2024, the Shadow Fleet had absorbed enough damage and implemented enough countermeasures that the cost-benefit analysis of continued drone strikes began to shift. Intelligence reports suggested that Russia was now losing ships at a slower rate despite increased attempt frequency. Some strikes were being detected and mitigated. Others were being avoided through better route planning. Few were being defended against through active countermeasures. This led to a fascinating strategic pivot. Instead of continuing to focus on individual ship targeting, Western-aligned forces and Ukraine began shifting toward a different operational objective. Rather than trying to destroy Shadow Fleet vessels one at a time, they started targeting the infrastructure that supported the fleet. This included the repair yards where Shadow Fleet ships got maintenance, the insurance networks that insured them, the financial intermediaries that processed the payments. A ship can be repaired if it survives a strike, but a repair yard can't function if it's under sustained sanctions pressure or if insurance becomes unavailable or prohibitively expensive. This was the strategy of attacking the ecosystem rather than the individual nodes within that ecosystem. And from a strategic perspective, it was arguably more effective than the drone strikes had ever been. Because here's the critical insight that took Western planners several months to fully appreciate. Destroying a $200 million ship is impressive and makes for compelling video. But what actually constrains Russia's ability to maintain the shadow fleet isn't the availability of old tankers. The world's maritime scrapyards are full of aging vessels that can be repurposed. What constrains the shadow fleet is the financial infrastructure required to operate it at scale. A shadow fleet ship needs insurance. It needs financing. It needs access to fuel supply networks. It needs maintenance from recognized shipyards. It needs crews willing to work on vessels known to be targets. All of these elements require financial transactions that leave traces, that require intermediaries. And that can be disrupted through sanctions pressure on the institutions that facilitate those transactions. By shifting the focus away from individual ship, targeting towards systemic financial disruption, Western nations were essentially saying, we're going to make it not just dangerous to operate a shadow fleet vessel, but also expensive and administratively complex. And that's a fundamentally different calculus than simply destroying ships. Russia's energy sector depends on moving crude oil to market. The shadow fleet moves roughly to 20% of Russia's crude oil exports in terms of tonnage, though a higher percentage in terms of revenue because they're shipping it to buyers who are willing to pay premium prices for sanctions, evading deliveries. If the financial infrastructure that supports that shadow fleet becomes too expensive or too risky to use, Russia faces a genuine strategic problem. They can't easily replace those vessels with legitimate maritime commerce because legitimate shipping requires transparency, flag registration, and compliance with international regulations. The whole point of the shadow fleet is that it doesn't comply. So if they lose the financial ecosystem that supports the shadow fleet, they don't just lose the ships. They lose the operational model itself. This is where we are in early 2025. The drone strikes created the initial shock that demonstrated vulnerability. But Russia's tactical adaptations limited the effectiveness of continued individual ship targeting. The strategic response has been to shift toward financial ecosystem disruption, which operates on a longer timeline, but potentially affects the fundamental viability of the shadow fleet model. The shadow fleet remains operational, but it's under increasing pressure from multiple vectors simultaneously. Ships are harder to hit because they're more defensive and less predictable. Crews are harder to recruit because the risk premium is climbing. Insurance is harder to obtain because underwriters are facing regulatory pressure. Fuel is harder to source because supply chain intermediaries are becoming less willing to facilitate transactions. Repairs are harder to complete because many shipyards are either sanctioned or facing pressure not to service shadow fleet vessels. Russia is still moving oil through the shadow fleet. The system hasn't collapsed. But the efficiency margin that made it economically viable is being compressed from multiple directions. That compression is happening at a pace that's difficult for Russia to counter because each pressure vector requires a different operational response. What Western strategic planners have essentially done is implement a slow-motion strangulation of the shadow fleet logistics network. It's not as visible as a dramatic drone strike, and it doesn't generate compelling video footage. But from a strategic perspective, it's potentially more effective because it targets the entire ecosystem rather than individual components. The question now is whether Russia can accelerate the adaptation faster than the sanctions pressure can increase. Can they develop alternative financial infrastructure faster than Western nations can close down the existing networks? Can they find new insurance providers faster than existing ones withdraw? Can they identify new crew sources faster than recruitment becomes impossible? These are the strategic competitions now playing out beneath the surface of what appears to be a relatively static situation. The shadow fleet isn't gone. Ships are still being hit occasionally. Drones are still being deployed. The real struggle is happening in the financial sector, in insurance offices, in crew recruitment centers, in diplomatic channels, where nations are debating sanctions policy. And this is where the broader pattern becomes visible. Russia's adaptation to shadow fleet targeting isn't unique. It's part of a larger strategic pattern where authoritarian systems demonstrate Remarkable resilience to individual tactical strikes, but remain vulnerable to systemic economic pressure. The question is whether Western nations can maintain the unified coordination required to sustain that economic pressure over the long term, or whether sanctions fatigue and political disagreements will create gaps that Russia can exploit. Because here's what's often missed in defense analysis. The Shadow Fleet wasn't designed to be invulnerable to individual strikes. It was designed to be too distributed, too resilient, and too economically important to completely shut down. Russia knew some ships would get hit. They budgeted for losses. But they calculated that the strategic value of moving oil outside of sanctions-approved channels would outweigh the costs of attrition. The real vulnerability isn't in ship design or defensive countermeasures. It's in the assumption that the coalition maintaining sanctions pressure would stay unified. If the European Union decides to ease restrictions on Russian energy to address energy prices, if China develops alternative financial infrastructure that bypasses Western sanctions enforcement, if insurance companies find loopholes in regulatory frameworks, then the entire economic calculus that's currently strangling the Shadow Fleet changes. That's the next chapter in this conflict that most strategic analysis is missing. Satellite monitoring, thermal imaging, command center, night operations. But here's what makes this moment even more significant than the tactical victories themselves. The Shadow Fleet's existence proves something fundamental about modern economic warfare that conventional analysis keeps getting wrong. When you impose sanctions, you're not just restricting a nation's access to markets. You're creating an entire parallel infrastructure that operates in the spaces between enforcement. And once that infrastructure exists, it becomes almost impossible to dismantle without constant escalating pressure. Cargo ships, ocean, radar tracking, world map, maritime logistics, Russia's Shadow Fleet operates on what you might call distributed resilience. No single ship is critical. No single route is irreplaceable. No single loss threatens the entire operation. This is why conventional military strikes, tactically significant, don't represent a strategic breakthrough. Ukraine can hit 10 ships. Russia can commission 10 more, or simply rotate vessels from dormant fleets that have been maintained in strategic reserve. The economic cost to replace a single tanker is somewhere between $50 and $80 million. For Russia, that's a significant expense, but it's an expense they've already factored into their operational budget. Shipyard construction, industrial cranes, vessel repair, maritime industry. What's happening right now is a grinding war of attrition played out across the global maritime system. A drone strike on a Shadow Fleet vessel sends a signal to insurance markets, shipping brokers, financial institutions that the risk premium for operating these vessels is rising. That rising risk is gradually pushing older, less efficient vessels out of service. It's making crews demand higher compensation. It's forcing shipping companies to source vessels from increasingly marginal suppliers. But it's not stopping the flow. It's just making it more expensive and less efficient. Insurance documents, contract rejection, compliance, maritime paperwork. The real vulnerability of the Shadow Fleet isn't operational, it's institutional. Depends on a specific constellation of political alignments. Right now, the United States and European Union are coordinated in their commitment to Russian sanctions enforcement. But that alignment is fragile. European energy prices are a constant pressure point. If a particularly harsh winter pushes heating costs in Germany or Poland to crisis levels, political pressure to ease Russian energy restrictions becomes enormous. And once the first crack appears in the sanctions coalition, the Shadow Fleet adapts instantly. Energy grid, power distribution map, Europe infrastructure, energy crisis. This is where the analysis often breaks down. Western analysts focus on tactical victories. They count destroyed ships. They measure drone damage against Shadow Fleet assets. But what they miss is that the Shadow Fleet is less a military problem and more a political problem disguised as a logistics challenge. You can sink every vessel Russia owns, and if the political will to maintain sanctions collapses, Russia simply rebuilds. The sanctions work not because of any specific military action, but because of the collective economic pressure they maintain. It's infinitely more fragile than any individual targeting system. Diplomacy meeting, international negotiation, financial discussion. Boardroom consider the insurance question more carefully. A ship that's flagged as part of the Russian Shadow Fleet can't easily obtain comprehensive coverage through major Western or European insurance markets. There are smaller specialized underwriters in Dubai, Hong Kong, Singapore who operate in regulatory grey zones. These underwriters don't ask too many questions about the ultimate ownership of vessels. As long as the paperwork technically clears, they'll provide coverage. But each drone strike increases the likelihood that even these grey market insurers will demand prohibitive premiums or simply refuse coverage entirely. At that point, ships become uninsurable. Uninsurable ships have to operate with restricted crew, limited ports of call, and massive risk premiums. Insurance broker office, maritime business, Southeast Asia shipping, commercial desk, that pressure doesn't eliminate the shadow fleet. It makes it progressively more expensive to operate. It raises the cost per barrel of crude oil Russia can export. It forces Moscow to offer deeper discounts to customers willing to buy through shadow fleet channels. It gradually erodes the economic advantage that sanctions busting was supposed to provide in the first place. From a strategic standpoint, it's the real goal. Not to sink every ship, but to make the entire operation just expensive enough that it threatens Russia's energy export margins. Economic graph trending, price decline chart, cost analysis, financial data, the drone operators and their handlers understand this. They're not trying to destroy Russia's capacity to export oil. They're trying to make that capacity increasingly expensive and logistically complex. Each successful strike is a statement to the insurance market, to port authorities, to financial intermediaries, to potential customers that shadow fleet operations carry real costs. That message travels instantly through digital networks and trader networks. It shapes behavior across the entire ecosystem. Port facility night, container terminal, cargo operations, maritime harbor. If you want to understand the longer game that's actually being played here, put together a detailed resource in the description and pinned comment that breaks down how sanctions enforcement actually works across maritime systems. It goes much deeper into the financial networks that enable or disable shadow fleet operations, and how individual tactical actions cascade into economic effects. That's the level of analysis you need to understand why a $20,000 drone hitting one tanker actually matters strategically, even if that one tanker isn't decisive on its own. Classified documents, intelligence report, analysis papers, security briefing now, there's another layer to this that deserves attention. The shadow fleet problem exists because of a fundamental asymmetry in how global trade infrastructure was designed. Western financial institutions, port authorities, and regulatory bodies all have sophisticated systems for tracking, identifying, restricting access to vessels flagged as sanctioned. But Russia adapted by creating a fleet that deliberately obscures its ownership, flag state, and ultimate destination. The adaptation was rapid and sophisticated. Within months of the initial sanctions wave, Russia had developed a parallel shipping infrastructure that was nominally independent but operationally integrated into their energy export strategy. Ship interior diagram, vessel systems technical, 3D ship model, maritime engineering. The genius of this adaptation, from a military strategy standpoint, is that it doesn't require any technological innovation. Russia didn't need to build new ships. They didn't need to develop new propulsion systems. They just needed to reorganize the ownership and operational structure of existing vessels. A ship that was previously flagged under Russian registry becomes flagged under a Maltese or Cypriot shell company. The crew changes, the insurance provider changes, the routing changes, but the ship itself is identical. From a tactical standpoint, what you're attacking is not a Russian military asset. It's a civilian cargo vessel operated by what appears to be an independent commercial entity. Legal distinction matters enormously in international maritime law. Corporate shell companies, flag state changes, maritime identity, ship registration. Ukraine's response to this legal ambiguity has been to simply ignore it. Their operators identify shadow fleet vessels. Through intelligence gathering and satellite reconnaissance, they strike them regardless of flag state or nominal ownership. This is strategically audacious because it explicitly rejects the fiction that these are independent commercial vessels. But it's also legally and diplomatically complicated. Each strike on a shadow fleet vessel can be characterized as an attack on neutral commercial shipping. Characterization creates diplomatic pressure on Western governments to either condemn the attacks or distance themselves from them. United Nations Assembly, diplomatic voting, international relations, UN Chamber. This is the diplomatic minefield that makes the shadow fleet problem. so difficult to solve at a strategic level. The military capability to hit ships exists, the intelligence to find them exists. But the political coalition needed to publicly endorse those strikes while maintaining diplomatic cover is fragile. That's why the attacks happen. They're rarely claimed. That's why Ukraine maintains operational ambiguity about whether these strikes are even happening. That's why Western governments express concern about shadow fleet operations, while maintaining official distance from the specific tactics used against them. News broadcast, media coverage, international reporting, news channels. The Shadow Fleet War is ultimately a competition between two different visions of how global supply chains should be governed. On one side, the Western coalition argues that sanctions enforcement requires the ability to identify and restrict specific vessels from accessing ports and financial systems. On the other side, Russia argues that nations have the sovereign right to sell their natural resources however they choose, that Western attempts to restrict those sales amount to economic coercion. Both sides have rhetorical and legal arguments that hold water within their respective frameworks. But the actual conflict isn't being decided in courtrooms or diplomatic chambers. It's being decided by the costs and logistics of operating a shadow fleet when that fleet is being actively targeted. Debate concept split screen versus comparison visual, conflicting perspectives, political ideology. What makes this conflict genuinely novel is that it's being waged not by conventional militaries, but by combinations of intelligence services, drone operators, commercial satellite companies, maritime logistics specialists, and regulatory authorities. A naval battle in the traditional sense would involve warships, surface-to-surface missiles, and command and control systems operated by military personnel. The Shadow Fleet War involves reconnaissance satellites, autonomous drones that cost less than a luxury car, and operators who are sometimes military but sometimes civilian contractors. It's the future of great power conflict bleeding into the present, and most security analysis still hasn't caught up to what's actually happening. Military technology operators, intelligence analysts, maritime professionals, modern warfare personnel. The deeper question underlying all of this is whether economic sanctions, when combined with precision military strikes on civilian infrastructure, actually represent a sustainable model for imposing strategic costs on major powers. The traditional answer was that sanctions alone were ineffective against determined states. Military action alone was too escalatory and too resource intensive. But hybrid approaches, economic pressure combined with targeted strikes on specific infrastructure, might offer a third path. This is the experiment being conducted in real time with the Shadow Fleet. History sanctions regimes, economic embargo timeline, international sanctions policy, historical comparison. If the Shadow Fleet strategy works at scale, it changes the fundamental calculus of how great powers manage economic competition. If sustained pressure, distributed across logistics, finance, and military targeting, can genuinely constrain a major power's revenue streams, then the Cold War model of sanctions plus diplomacy might actually be viable in the modern era. But if Russia successfully adapts its Shadow Fleet to continue operations despite ongoing losses, then the message to other sanctioned states is clear. Sanctions are manageable, and parallel logistics networks can sustain you indefinitely. Future prediction visualization, scenario planning, diverging paths, strategic outcomes. The data right now suggests that the middle path is most likely. The Shadow Fleet will continue to operate, but at gradually increasing cost. The number of vessels will fluctuate, but likely remain relatively stable or grow slowly. The marginal profitability per barrel of crude exported will decline, but not collapse. Russia will find ways to absorb the losses and adjust pricing to compensate. The coalition maintaining sanctions pressure will remain functional, but will face periodic pressure to ease restrictions based on energy price spikes, geopolitical considerations. In other words, this isn't a problem that will be solved through continued drone strikes. It's a problem that will be managed through persistent, low-level pressure indefinitely. Statistical trends analysis, economic forecasting graph, data visualization, business metrics. This is also why the individual drone strikes, while tactically satisfying and strategically significant, are ultimately just moves in a much longer game. Each strike generates headlines. Each strike provides a morale boost to supporters of Ukraine's resistance. Each strike reminds potential customers of Shadow Fleet shipping that they're taking on real risk. but none of the individual strikes threaten to unravel the entire system. The system is designed to absorb individual losses and continue functioning. It's not a weakness, that's the actual design principle. Network diagram system, interconnected nodes, logistics network, system resilience. For those of you who want to go deeper into how maritime sanctions enforcement actually works, how the insurance loopholes function, what the realistic timeline looks like for constraining shadow fleet operations through current methods, prepared a comprehensive breakdown that you can find in the description and in the pinned comment. It covers the specific regulatory frameworks, the institutional players, and the pressure points where additional action could potentially accelerate the timeline for shadow fleet degradation. That analysis is essential context if you're genuinely interested in understanding the mechanics of modern economic warfare. Online resources description, pinned comment notification, digital interface, screen content. The larger lesson here, beyond the specific case of the shadow fleet, is that modern warfare isn't primarily about weapon systems anymore. It's about information, logistics, political will to sustain pressure over extended periods. A drone that costs $20,000 can cause damage equivalent to $1 million aircraft. A satellite constellation operated by a commercial company can provide targeting intelligence that military intelligence agencies fought for decades to achieve. A legal regulatory action by a port authority can disrupt operations more effectively than a military strike. The actors are diverse, the methods are hybrid, the timescale is measured in years rather than days. This is the operational environment that militaries worldwide are struggling to adapt to. Ukraine is essentially writing the textbook on how to compete effectively within it. Military evolution history, modern warfare technology, hybrid conflict, defense innovation. As you consume news and analysis about the Shadow Fleet, the drone strikes, broader sanctions regime against Russia, keep this analytical framework in mind. Individual strikes matter, but only as part of a larger system of pressure. Economic sanctions work, but only if they're sustainable and broadly supported. Military action matters, but only if it serves a coherent strategic objective. The Shadow Fleet War checks all of those boxes right now. Whether it continues to do so depends on factors that are far beyond the control of drone operators or military planners. It depends on European energy prices. It depends on the political stability of the sanctions coalition. It depends on whether alternative global financial infrastructure emerges to undermine sanctions enforcement. It depends on whether insurance markets continue to price shadow fleet operations as a viable, if expensive, business. All of those variables are in flux, and any single change could shift the entire trajectory. Complex systems visualization, multiple variables, interconnected dynamics, system analysis, that's the reality of modern strategic warfare. It's not decided by individual tactical victories. It's decided by whether you can sustain pressure across multiple domains simultaneously while your opponent can't sustain their adaptation indefinitely. Ukraine is effectively doing that right now with the Shadow Fleet. But the long-term outcome isn't predetermined. It depends on whether the coalition supporting these operations can maintain unity, political will, material commitment over the extended period required to actually change Russian behavior at scale. That's the real challenge. That's what actually matters when the cables stop being cut and the drones stop flying. Mediterranean Sea Dawn, cargo ships horizon, ocean landscape, maritime scene. Thanks for watching this deep dive into how the Shadow Fleet actually works, how the economic mechanics of sanctions enforcement really function when they're backed by kinetic action. If you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe to Grey Zone Intel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new breakdown of the real operational dynamics shaping global security. The headline-friendly version of